Good morning. I'm Dave, one of the pastors here, and I'm glad we get to worship together today. You know, the passage we just read from Jeremiah 29 sounds pretty upbeat, but it was written to a group of people who were pretty upset. They felt out of place and unsure what to do. And some of us can relate to that feeling, because these days, Christians in Boston can feel a bit out of place. We're not supposed to wish strangers Merry Christmas anymore, and Simmons College here in Boston recently announced that even saying God bless you when somebody sneezes is a microaggression. These days, both our values and beliefs are regularly ridiculed. We're assumed to be backward and bigots. Have you ever felt embarrassed to admit you're a Christian? Have you ever felt a bit awkward about praying before eating in a restaurant or lunchroom? Have you ever felt like your morals and your convictions are made fun of? Like every opinion and perspective must be tolerated, even applauded. That is, everyone except yours. Does it ever feel costly to be a Christian? You know, it wasn't always this way. Decades ago, when I was growing up here, the whole city was strongly influenced by the churches, especially the Roman Catholic Church. They had a voice in almost everything that happened in the city. Shops were closed on Sundays, and no one would schedule a Little League game that conflicted with church services. Statues were built to honor popular pastors, and city streets were named after important church leaders. Until the Vatican forbade it, many of the local politicians were ordained priests. It was relatively easier to be a Christian in some ways, because the local culture had been founded by Christian pilgrims, and the culture still supported the values espoused by the church. In public schools, kids were taught, or not, about sexuality and morality in ways that mostly mirrored what was taught, or not, in Sunday school. TV never showed a man and a woman in bed together, even if they were married, much less any sex scenes or swearing. One of my friends used to be the regional manager for Sears decades ago, and he told me that when one store manager was discovered to be committing adultery, he was summarily fired, because the entire culture was devoted to practicing integrity and protecting families. In many ways, it was difficult to tell the difference between being an American and being a Christian, because they were almost the same thing. Even as a young teen who didn't care about Christianity yet, I was still shaped by its values because they were embedded in our culture. And this wasn't just in America. For more than a millennium, Europe was also shaped by the church, which had the power to dictate almost everything from political priorities to marriage, morality, dress codes, and church attendance. But it wasn't always that way. The earliest Christians were persecuted by the Roman authorities with marginalization and martyrdom. Being fed to lions was very real, as was crucifixion, just like Jesus experienced. It was countercultural and dangerous to be a Christian in those days. And yet, strangely, the church grew exponentially in that period, going from a handful of terrified disciples hiding behind a locked door that first Easter to more than 6 million followers less than 300 years later, which represented over 10% of the Roman Empire. What attracted people to devote their lives to Christ when it could be so costly? It was the love and lives of the Christians who followed Jesus by sacrificially serving their neighbors. They shared generously with those in need, cared for the sick, forgave those who sinned against them, and rescued babies that had been left to die and raised them as their own. Despite all this kindness and growth, the church remained actively persecuted and oppressed. But all this changed abruptly in the year 313, when the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, and then his successor, Theodosius, established Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380, almost overnight. The Christians changed from being a persecuted minority to the people in charge. Roman and European governments spent lavishly to build huge cathedrals, and cardinals had the power to appoint kings. Christians were able to shape culture and force people to do things our way. The church had won a mighty victory. or had she? Many historians see this as the moment Christians started to dominate the state. But others of us see it as the moment Christianity was domesticated by the state. Privilege turned out to be far more poisonous to true Christianity than persecution had ever been. It was no longer costly to be a Christian, so suddenly everyone was. Being a Christian no longer required sacrifices or risks. Indeed, within a few centuries, not being a Christian involved more sacrifices and risks. And spreading Christianity no longer required bold expressions of love, because now Christians had the sword, and they could force everyone to act like Christians, whether they believed or even understood Christianity at all. There were so many new Christians vying to get baptized so that they could get jobs with the government that church leaders had no time for discipleship anymore, no time to introduce people to what it means to follow Jesus in daily life. Some Christians in this period saw how diluted Christianity was becoming and fled into monasteries or the deserts where they could continue following Christ in ways that were countercultural and dynamic. But most people were happy to go with the flow. So one could argue that soon almost everyone was Christian, and yet at the same time, almost no one was. When I lived in Southern Virginia after college, I experienced something similar. Whenever I met a stranger, one of the first questions we'd ask is where the other went to church. It was the easiest way to locate someone socially. Nearly everyone associated with some church, whether they actually attended or not, whether they really believed or not. Being a Christian was relatively easier there because the culture was still shaped by Christianity, so it didn't require any hard decisions or sacrifices. But moving back to Boston was an abrupt change. Though the influence of the church has been waning for decades, especially in universities, after the Catholic sex abuse scandal broke in 2002, it was all over. Overnight, pastors and priests went from being the most respected people in society to the most suspect. People who used to feel pressure to justify why they skipped church now had to justify why they attended church. It was a pretty jarring change that happened in Boston sooner than the rest of America, but is slowly spreading everywhere. Eventually, the South will be like Boston is now. Academics call this post-Christendom, which is not the same as saying post-Christian. There could be just as many Christians. The key is that we're no longer in power. And I've seen two common responses among Christians to this sudden shift. The first is resistance. We separate the world into us and them. Politicians and preachers promise to take back America through prayer or politics. These Christians vote for people who promise to pass laws that will require everyone to behave the way we do, whether they believe what we do or not. Christians in this camp seem more concerned with laws than love, and often associate almost exclusively with each other so that we don't get polluted by our pagan neighbors. This response is often branded fundamentalism. A second common response is assimilation. You know, go along to get along. Don't make such a big deal about all this. And besides, the materialism and self-indulgence and self-centeredness currently favored in society is actually kind of pleasant. So why rock the boat? These Christians may still talk about character, justice, helping the poor, but are rarely interested in making the personal sacrifices in terms of time, money, or popularity in order to bring these changes about. They want to use political power to make other people sacrifice for the poor without it costing them too much. Sacrificial love for God and others is replaced by tolerance, which really means that I don't have to be all that concerned about anyone else. These Christians just want to fit in and be comfortable. As a result, they're nearly indistinguishable from their non-Christian neighbors. And their kids probably won't be Christians at all, because they've seen in their families how little difference this diluted Christianity makes. Fitting in or fighting back, the two most common religious responses to contemporary culture. But there's another way, and I know that because of what we read earlier from Jeremiah 29. In 2600 BC, the intelligentsia from Israel was taken into captivity 500 miles away in the city of Babylon by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. That city represented all that was evil in the world, all that was broken. It was a barbaric place that exploited those who were poor, weak, female, or foreigners. And this exile was a tactic. It was a way for Babylon to increase their power by means of indoctrination. Some nations, like the Egyptians, enslaved people. Some nations, like the Assyrians, committed genocide, but not the Babylonians. They took the best and the brightest from the nations they conquered and forced them to become Babylonian. This is what we see in the book of Daniel, when elite young Israelites were brought into the king's palace to be brainwashed into Babylonians. Now, you can imagine what this must have been like for the Israelites. They were devastated, and they longed for the comfort of home back in Jerusalem. They look at the corruption and evil of Babylon, and they see it as a threat to their youth and future. Nothing good can come out of Babylon, so they want nothing to do with it. Fortunately, this isn't going to last very long, because God's about to rescue them, or so it seems from reading Jeremiah 28, where the prophet Hananiah promises, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel says, I will break the yoke of the king of Babylon. Within 2 years, I will bring back to this place the articles of the Lord's house that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, removed from here and took to Babylon." Well, assured they wouldn't be in Babylon very long, many Israelites just decided to keep their heads down and ignore their neighbors as much as possible, keep from being polluted by the pagans, until they can get back to the nation where they get to set the rules, where they get to make the laws, so that everybody has to obey them. It made sense, because Hananiah revealed that God was going to bring them back home in just 24 short months. The problem is, God never said that. Those comforting words that God would bring them back in 2 years are just a lie. The prophet Hananiah is simply saying what he knew people wanted to hear. Words of reassurance, words of comfort, promises that would never be delivered. It's nice when we hear comforting things, isn't it? Wouldn't it be nice if you come here to church every week and hear assurances that everything's going to work out, it's all going to be okay. Don't worry, there's a spouse out there just waiting for you. It's fine. I'm sure you'll have a job in the next couple of months. You'll recover quickly from that disease or financial downturn. Your rocky marriage is just about to recover, and your rebellious kids will soon become strong Christians and solid citizens who will support you in your old age. Perhaps a modern-day Hananiah would say, "Don't worry, we'll vote in a president who will lead us back to Jesus, or we'll have a revival that will make Christianity respected again." Wouldn't that be nice? There are always plenty of prophets willing to tell us what we want to hear if it will make them profit. We have scores of TV preachers and self-help books doing the same thing today. But we don't really want someone just telling us what we wish were true. We want to know what's actually true, right? So Jeremiah told the Israelites the truth. God wasn't planning to bring them back to Jerusalem in 2 years, the way Hananiah said, but only after 70 years. These were not the comforting words that people wanted to hear. But Jeremiah went on to say some things that were surprising to the exiles and that might be surprisingly relevant for us today. Jeremiah writes, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." Let's just pause right there to consider the weight of this statement. Those I carried into exile. We see it again in verse 7. The city to which I carried you into exile. And in verse 14, I will bring you back from the place where I carried you into exile. The exile of God's people was not something that was out of God's hands. It was something not that God just allowed to happen. No, God is the one who did it. Now, why would God do this? Could it be that God has a plan? Could it be that God cared about Babylon and brought the Israelites there for a purpose? And if so, could it be that God cares about Greater Boston and has us here for a purpose? The Israelites couldn't believe it. We know from other Bible passages that they wrestled with the same alternatives in Babylon that we do in Boston. Some wanted to fight back or hide out as long as possible, refusing to relate to their neighbors, while other Israelites just gave up on God and became just like the Babylonians. Both of these can seem like easy ways to protect ourselves from discomfort or suffering. What these alternatives share in common is that both will make us miss God's purposes for us and for our neighbors. So starting in verse 5, Jeremiah introduces them to a third alternative, which is what God actually wanted them to do in Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. God's calling them to make that place home. It takes time to build houses and plant gardens. And when you plant a vineyard, it takes 3 years to get the first grapes and 7 years to grow ones that are finally drinkable. It takes decades to have kids and then see them get married. So clearly God's saying, settle down for the long haul. Stop pining for somewhere else. Stop complaining about the way things are. Stop grasping for the comfort and control you had back in Jerusalem. And seek the prosperity of Babylon instead. What? You mean our enemy, Babylon? You mean the ones who kidnapped us and dragged us to this awful place with foreign food and strange culture? Yes. That's exactly the message Jeremiah relays to the people. But to appreciate why it was so hard, I want you to imagine someone you hate. A deceptive coworker, a conniving classmate, or an offensive neighbor or family member. Whatever disdain you feel towards them, that's probably a fraction of how the Israelites felt about the Babylonians. And yet God instructs, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Can you believe what Jeremiah is saying? What are we supposed to love our enemies? Yep, I'm pretty sure that's what God meant. The Hebrew word that my NIV Bible translates as peace and prosperity is the word shalom. And it means so much more than just lack of war. No, it means seek the well-being, wholeness, harmony of the city. Make it flourish. Isn't it ironic that Nebuchadnezzar brought the Israelites to Babylon so that he could indoctrinate and assimilate them, but God's plan was that the Babylonians would be the ones who are transformed. And it worked. The books of Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther tell stories of the way God's people in captivity were able to affect entire empires by living boldly, generously, and obediently to God. And with that in mind, Peter wrote to the first generation of Christians who were also a marginalized minority in an oppressive empire. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles. Peter is referring explicitly to those Israelites in Babylon from Jeremiah 29. I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Well, that's exactly what they did. And within 12 generations, the church grew from just a few marginalized disciples to more than 6 million. Seek the shalom of the city. Friends, I'm telling you this today because this is also our call. It always has been. We aren't supposed to simply fit in with our coworkers, classmates, neighbors, or friends, but we're not called to fix them either. For too long, those have been the alternatives we've chosen between. But we're called to bless people. As Daniel and Esther prove, this can be more powerful than you might imagine. In his book, The Missional Entrepreneur, Mark Russell researched 12 business as mission groups in Thailand. These are people who use business as a way to do ministry. 6 of the companies focus primarily on developing successful businesses that enhance the local economy. Although they gladly discussed their faith, that was not the main focus. Russell called these businesses the blessers. 6 other businesses viewed conversion as their main priority. So they were much more concerned with the spiritual destiny of the local residents than with their economic improvement. Russell called these 6 businesses converters. What he discovered was that the blessers did much more social good, employed more people, raising local incomes. That's not surprising. What was surprising is that the blessers also experienced more people coming to Christ by a ratio of 48-1. Why was there such a disparity? The blessers demonstrated authentic love by improving the lives of those around them, which made their new friends trust them with their spiritual questions as well. The reason I finally became a Christian is because of the joy I saw and the love I experienced from Christians I knew. They didn't try to fix me or tell me why I was wrong. They just welcomed me into friendship. I was so prideful and argumentative that if they tried to debate me, they would have gotten nowhere. But just loving me while they loved Jesus was surprisingly powerful. So over the next 5 weeks, we want to remind you how to form authentic spiritual friendships that allow us to love people who don't know Jesus instead of trying to fix them, using an acronym that will remind us of each step. Begin with prayer. Listen. Eat together. Serve sacrificially. Share your stories. We want to learn to love without needing to be in power, which we'll discover can be very powerful. And this has always been High Rock's vision from the very first days. We dreamed to see God transforming every neighborhood and institution in Greater Boston through locally focused congregations who live and love in such a compelling and Christ-like way that our neighbors are challenged to seriously consider the claims of Christ. Be reconciled to God. Engage in Christian community and serve others in the unique ways God designed them to, so that Boston becomes a city on a hill that will be a blessing to the world. Friends, our world has changed, and not always for the better. Christians don't have the political or cultural power that we used to. But can I suggest that this is a good thing? It's a gift. After years of being blinded by power, suddenly we're free to be real Christians again, like the way they were in the beginning. Christians who win people through sacrificial love instead of cultural control or political manipulation. We don't need that kind of power because our vision statement is clear that it's God who does the transforming. We just have to do the loving. My guess is that a lot of us who have depended on worldly privilege and power to do God's work will have to learn from the Black church in America, which has been leading without power for 400 years in ways that have been transformational and beautiful. We need to learn from the persecuted churches in China and Sri Lanka. Friends, it's not enough to vote for the right people. We need to be the right people. We need to become Christians who follow Christ more than our comfort. We need to become Christians who lead with love instead of power. That is our call. That's our vision. Our cities, our neighborhoods, our institutions, our neighbors, connecting with God personally, connecting with God's people, connecting with God's purposes. God has a purpose for Christians in Boston, just like God had a purpose for the Israelites in Babylon. But just like they almost did, many of us are at risk of missing it. If we think we're honoring God by using political power to make other people do what we want them to, we're probably missing God's call. If we think we're honoring God by avoiding our neighbors or classmates so that we aren't polluted by them, we're probably missing God's call. If we think we're honoring God by simply pursuing our private spiritual lives, we're missing what it means to be like Christ. If we think we can make a difference that matters while being just like our neighbors, we're kidding ourselves. No, our call is to bless our neighbors in ways that are different than they're used to. It's in this context that Jeremiah writes what is one of the most beloved but misunderstood verses in the entire Bible. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. We usually read this as our own personal promise that God is going to make our lives easy and fun, maybe even wealthy. But the Lord makes this promise while explaining to Israel that they're going to remain captives in Babylon for the next 70 years. This verse is really about God's mission in the world and the way we're enlisted to play a part in it, which God warns that we'll miss if we only look out for ourselves. God's promise is that if they serve their neighbors by seeking the shalom of the city, they'll discover that this is the unexpected pathway to true prosperity that involves far more than just money. My experience is that whenever I simply serve myself, I only end up more miserable. It's true in marriage, it's true in friendships, it's true in the way that I interact with my neighbors. But when I devote myself to serving God by serving others, I find freedom and joy that was unattainable on my own. And we'll find God in places we never expected God would be. Your city, your workplace, classroom, family, or relationship. God is there. God loves those people, which we'll only see when we start to serve. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. Friends, I know that some of you want to hide or fight or just give in and serve yourself like everybody else does. But God has a plan to give us a hope and a future. And in order to get there, God is calling us to serve, not just for the weekend or a summer mission trip, but right here, for the long haul. God's on a mission, not only to save those people who are already in God's family, but also to bless those who are not yet. And that means that we have a mission. So when we look at the broken things around us, opioid abuse, income inequality, racial injustice, gender injustice, broken families, we can take heart because God has a plan. But we can't sit idly by because we are a part of that plan. God is sending us. So friends, I want to challenge you to ask the question, how am I blessing people around me? How am I making a difference wherever God has placed me? The company that I'm in, the family I'm in, the school I'm in, the neighborhood I'm in, the nation I'm in, the world I'm in. That's what we want to explore over the next 5 weeks. And we can begin today by asking God to speak to each of us about how we could make a difference by being different. How can I engage my neighbors in ways that are transformational rather than just transactional? It's not enough to seek the shalom of my friends or my family. It's not enough to enjoy the city, taking advantage of the arts and opportunities. God has called us to seek the shalom of the city, to change this place. Let's pray together and ask God how He may call each of us to be a part of that plan.